In the dim light of a Pacific dawn, long before the first shells fell, some Japanese soldiers already sensed that something far beyond their trenches had begun to slip out of control. Supplies arrived too slowly. Reinforcements came in smaller numbers than promised. And across the water, the Americans kept coming, wave after wave, as if drawn from an inexhaustible sea. What those men could not yet know was that the foundation of their war effort had been built on a silent error made thousands of miles away, an intelligence estimate that would misjudge the strength of the United States Navy by more than sevenfold. Tokyo believed it was facing a fleet supported by roughly 300,000 sailors. The truth was closer to 2.4 million. This wasn't just a numerical mistake. It was a failure of understanding, a blind spot born from culture, doctrine, and the quiet confidence that their enemy could never mobilize beyond a certain point. And it leads us to the question that shapes this entire story. How does a nation lose a war before it ever realizes the scale of the battlefield? The roots of Japan's intelligence failure lay in an institution that entered the Pacific War already unprepared for the scale of the conflict ahead. Inside the Army General Staff's Second Bureau, only a handful of officers were assigned to study foreign militaries, and even fewer were trained to think beyond narrow tactical evaluations. Their focus had long been directed toward the Soviet Union, not the United States, and the tools they relied on were shaped by peacetime assumptions rather than wartime urgency. In a military culture that prized courage and offensive spirit, analysis was an afterthought. This approach created blind spots that would shape every estimate that followed. Japanese intelligence officers understood American ship designs, firing doctrines, and battle formations with admirable detail. Yet, they had almost no insight into the human engine required to operate a modern navy. They never examined the scale of American shipyard expansion, or the social structures that allowed civilian workers, college students, and farm boys to be turned into sailors at unprecedented speed. The idea that the United States might rebuild its military from the ground up simply did not fit within their worldview. Evidence of the problem began appearing almost as soon as Japan met the United States in open combat. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the first reports from the front insisted that no more than 2,000 Marines were on the island. When fighting intensified, commanders were stunned to discover that the Americans had landed more than 10,000 men. Months later, Japanese estimates still placed American strength at 10,000, when the reality was more than double. Each new encounter revealed a larger force than the one predicted on Tokyo's charts. The pattern extended far beyond Guadalcanal. On the Bataan Peninsula, Japanese planners believed they faced a force of 25,000 under General Douglas MacArthur, yet more than 80,000 troops were defending the ground. In Singapore, they expected 30,000 British soldiers and encountered nearly triple that number. Even at Midway, where Japan meticulously planned a decisive blow, their estimate of the island's garrison was off by thousands. Each discrepancy should have triggered a reassessment of American capabilities. None did. What made these warnings so easy to ignore was the belief that American society lacked the discipline required for total war. Many Japanese officers assumed the United States would be unable to train, equip, and deploy a force much larger than its pre-war navy. The notion that America could mobilize millions of people, sustain them through a global conflict, and replace losses faster than they occurred seemed implausible, even fantastical. That belief would shape every strategic calculation Japan made. By late 1942, the gap between Japanese assumptions and battlefield reality had become too large to overlook, yet the institutions responsible for analysis remained unchanged. Intelligence officers still lacked authority within the hierarchy. Reports that contradicted the preferred narrative were dismissed as exaggerations or enemy deception. And so, with each passing month, Japan drifted deeper into a war, fought on the basis of numbers that no longer reflected the world beyond their maps. These early miscalculations formed the foundation of a much larger failure, one that would echo across every major campaign in the Pacific. The war Japan thought it was fighting did not exist. The war that awaited them was far larger, faster, and far more industrial than anything their intelligence system had prepared them to understand. By 1943, the war in the Pacific had entered a phase defined not only by battles at sea and on land, but by the rising force behind them, the American system of industrialized training. Nowhere was this more evident than at Naval Station Great Lakes, a sprawling base far from any coastline, where the quiet waters of Lake Michigan reflected a transformation Japan never saw coming. What had once been a modest pre-war facility had become the heartbeat of a mobilization effort on a scale without precedent. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the number of recruits in training at Great Lakes swelled from a few thousand to tens of thousands. In 1942, more than 68,000 men filled its barracks. By September of that year, the base held over 100,000 trainees at once. Instructors operated in continuous cycles, teaching navigation, gunnery, seamanship, and survival to waves of recruits who arrived faster than records could track. Over the course of the war, more than 1 million sailors would pass through Great Lakes alone, each one a quiet answer to Japan's assumption that America lacked the discipline for total war. But Great Lakes was only the beginning. Across the country, the United States Navy built training centers with the same speed and scale it applied to shipyards. At Sampson in New York, at Farragut in Idaho, and at Bainbridge in Maryland, entire facilities rose from empty ground in a matter of months. These bases were designed not to perfect a small elite force, but to produce a steady river of trained personnel who could step aboard destroyers, carriers, and submarines as soon as they were launched. Japanese intelligence, relying on pre-war records and limited reconnaissance, never detected the expansion. To them, these places simply did not exist. The American system extended even deeper into the nation's civilian life. With the launch of the V-12 program in 1943, universities across the country became hubs of officer training. Students marched to class in uniform, studied engineering and communications under military discipline, and prepared to enter the fleet as technical specialists. By war's end, 125,000 men had passed through the program. This single pipeline produced more officers than Japan believed the entire American Navy possessed in total personnel. Such scale had consequences that were felt on every front. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japan's commanders repeatedly reported being overwhelmed by logistics flows they could not comprehend. Convoys destroyed by submarines seemed to reappear within days. Ships damaged in battle returned to the fight manned by fresh crews who had been in training only weeks earlier. What Japan viewed as exaggeration or propaganda was simply the predictable output of a nation that had mobilized its population with industrial efficiency. The truth became impossible to ignore during the Marianas Campaign of 1944. On Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the defenders watched wave after wave of landing craft approach the beaches, each one filled with Marines and soldiers who seemed to have no end. The naval gunfire never paused. The airstrikes never thinned. What the Japanese witnessed was the culmination of a training system capable of sustaining continuous offensive operations, something no Japanese estimate had ever accounted for. In those weeks, the gap between Japan's assumptions and America's reality finally revealed itself in stark, undeniable terms. The war Japan believed it could shape through decisive battles was now being carried forward by an enemy whose strength renewed itself with every tide. The turning point came not from a single decision, but from a chain of losses that Japan could no longer absorb. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked the beginning of a decline that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could reverse. 4 fleet carriers were lost, but the deeper wound lay in the death of the aviators who had trained for years to master skills that could not be reproduced quickly. Every pilot who fell represented time Japan no longer had. As the months passed, Japan attempted to accelerate its training programs, but the system cracked under its own limitations. There were too few instructors, too few aircraft, and too little fuel to bring new pilots to proficiency. Every shortcut reduced the quality of the next generation, and each setback carved another layer out of Japan's remaining capability. It became a downward spiral. Fewer veterans meant weaker training, and weaker training meant higher casualties. The contrast with the American system grew sharper with each battle. When an American destroyer suffered losses, it could return to port, receive fresh crew from Great Lakes or Farragut, and be back at sea in a matter of weeks. The ship was restored, the mission resumed, and the tempo maintained. A Japanese destroyer facing the same losses might spend months waiting for replacements, and sometimes there were none at all. Japan's submariners felt the consequences firsthand. In 1944, submarine crews repeatedly reported astonishment at the volume of American logistics traffic crossing the Pacific. Tankers, transports, and supply ships sailed in seemingly endless streams. Even when Japanese submarines managed to sink vessels, the lanes filled again almost immediately, as though the losses had been erased. The crews asked where these replacements were coming from, unaware that millions of Americans had already passed through training systems Japan never detected. By the summer of 1944, operational reality forced Japan to confront the truth. The Marianas had fallen. The combined fleet had been shattered in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American submarines had destroyed much of Japan's merchant shipping, choking the nation's war economy. In September, the Naval General Staff finally conducted a comprehensive review that revised their estimate of American naval personnel to between 1.8 and 2.2 million. It was the first accurate number they produced in the entire war, but accuracy arrived too late to matter. Strategic options Japan might have considered earlier: defensive depth, dispersed production, a war of attrition designed to raise American costs, were no longer feasible. The war Japan had planned to fight had closed its doors, and a new reality, shaped by American scale and endurance, had already taken its place. No adjustment in strategy could alter the outcome. By 1945, the consequences of the original miscalculation were visible in every facet of Japanese military power. Ships sailed with incomplete crews. Air units operated with pilots who had only a fraction of the training their predecessors received. Fuel shortages crippled operations before battles even began. The Empire's remaining strength was eroded not just by enemy action, but by the slow collapse of a system that had never been built to replenish itself. In the end, Japan did not lose because its soldiers fought without resolve or its ships lacked capability. It lost because it waged a modern, industrial war with a pre-war understanding of manpower, training, and national mobilization. The cost of that misunderstanding was measured in fleets sunk, islands lost, and a war that could no longer be won by the time the truth was finally understood. From the American viewpoint, the war in the Pacific was not only a struggle of fleets and islands, but a demonstration of what a fully mobilized democracy could achieve. The United States had combined its industrial strength, its educational system, and its social cohesion into a single engine of war. Factories that once produced cars now produced ships, while universities that once trained civilians now created officers and specialists for a global navy. It was a model of national coordination that few nations had ever matched. This mobilization reshaped how the world understood modern warfare. Allies observed that the United States did not rely solely on the skill of its pre-war forces, but on its ability to generate new strength continuously. The idea that victory depended on staying power rather than perfection began to spread across military thinking. Even the Soviet Union and Britain, each experienced in total war, took note of America's capacity to merge civilian life and military necessity with such speed and precision. For Japan's adversaries, the American approach offered a sobering lesson in adaptation. A nation that had once seemed distant and untested revealed an unexpected talent for absorbing losses and emerging stronger. Battles like the Philippine Sea and the Marianas were not just tactical victories. They showcased a strategic reality. The United States could sustain offensive operations indefinitely, supported by an unbroken flow of trained personnel and logistical power. That endurance altered the trajectory of the war. Globally, the consequences extended beyond the Pacific. Observers recognized that future conflicts would hinge not only on elite forces, but on the systems that produced and maintained them. Training pipelines, industrial resilience, and national unity became markers of strategic strength. In that sense, America's wartime transformation influenced military doctrines far removed from the Pacific theater. It set expectations for what a modern nation must be prepared to mobilize. Japan, meanwhile, stood as a reminder of what happens when a country fights with outdated assumptions. Its leaders believed that spirit, discipline, and experience would outweigh an opponent's industrial advantage. But the world watched as those beliefs collapsed under the weight of American capacity. The gap between myth and reality had become impossible to ignore. By the end of the war, one truth stood out. The United States had shown that victory in a modern conflict required more than bravery on the battlefield. It required a nation willing to transform itself entirely, from its factories to its classrooms. And the world would not forget that lesson. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, numbers alone do not tell the whole story. What mattered was how those numbers reflected the deeper truths of national character, institutional strength, and the willingness of a society to transform itself for survival. Japan's miscalculation was not simply an intelligence error. It was a window into an entire system that struggled to see beyond its own assumptions. And once those assumptions were shattered, There was no path back to the war Japan believed it could win. The United States, by contrast, revealed a different kind of power. One rooted not in the brilliance of a few, but in the collective resolve of millions. Farmers from Iowa, students from Illinois, and factory workers from Detroit stepped into uniforms and learned the skills of sailors, aviators, and technicians. They were trained in classrooms, in makeshift barracks, in ship simulators built hundreds of miles from the ocean. Together, they formed a navy whose strength could be renewed with every season. A force that proved endurance can be as decisive as firepower. This transformation left a legacy that extends far beyond the history books. It reshaped how nations think about war, how militaries are built, and how societies confront crises that demand more than ordinary effort. It reminds us that modern conflict is not decided solely by courage or tactics, but by institutions capable of adapting faster than the challenges they face. And it warns that underestimating an opponent is often the first step toward defeat. Today, the lessons of that misjudgment still speak with quiet clarity. They speak to policymakers, to military strategists, and to anyone who studies the long shadow of global conflict. They remind us that a nation's strength lies not only in its weapons, but in its people, its systems, and its willingness to learn from the past. And they invite us to reflect on how fragile victory can be when built on assumptions rather than understanding. If this story prompts you to think about the price of miscalculation, consider sharing your thoughts. What do you believe is the most enduring lesson from Japan's strategic oversight? And if you value exploring the decisions that shaped our world, we invite you to subscribe and continue this journey with us. The battles may be over, but the history is still being written one insight at a time.